in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast. If you have poor breathing coordination, your economy of contraction or your efficiency of muscle contraction for your respiratory muscles is going to be poor. And then that's going to start to fatigue those muscles. And then those muscles actually could, wind up stealing a little bit more blood away from, your muscles, your brain, your heart, other things like that, and then limit your performance as well. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by Coach Michelle Simmons. Michelle is a triathlon coach out of Hawaii who got her start in triathlon in 1995. She had a 25-year career where she completed 18 Ironmans, 4 of which were racing at the World Championships in Hawaii. Michelle is a lifelong learner and has been a full-time coach for the last 15 years. She is the founder and head coach at Team BSC Triathlon. She works with amateurs of all ages and abilities. She is actively involved in supporting endurance sports on Oahu, where she lives, and does a lot of other work for the endurance community in Hawaii. I absolutely love talking to Michelle because she is so inquisitive and is always trying to connect what she observes as a coach to the underlying physiology. This episode is a continuation of a series Michelle and I started that talks about how to translate science into coaching practices. For today, we initially had a lot of topics we wanted to cover, but instead, we started with how breathing can affect your physiology. Michelle initially changed her breathing in order to manage stress, and she found it helped her with her endurance training as well. This was such a great conversation that we actually ended up talking for over an hour all about breathing. So without further ado, please enjoy the discussion I had with Coach Michelle Simmons on breathwork and how it affects your physiology. Michelle, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So Michelle is somebody who I would describe as a lifelong learner, and she told me when she first got on, she was like, "I'm going to ask you a lot of questions." I was like, "Perfect," because did you reach out to me on Instagram? Is that like how we first met and we started talking?
I think the first time. So this might be a good introduction to segue into what we want to talk about, like the breathing thing to start. The first time I think I reached out to you was after I had spent some time at altitude. Mm-hmm. So I live at sea level, and I went to Colorado to ride the triple bypass ride with some of my girlfriends, and I died. I mean, like I'm a decent cyclist at sea level, and I went up there and I'm like, what is happening? Like I absolutely had no access to any of my power.
Yep.
And so I wear this Oura ring, which I see you have one too. Mm-hmm. And it was at the time when Oura had just come out with their oxygen saturation numbers. Remember, like in the beginning, they didn't have that. And then maybe, I don't know, 2 years ago, they came out with showing us our O2 saturation overnight. And I'm looking at and so I'm sleeping. I went straight from sea level to 9,400 feet, I think. So we're sleeping in Breckenridge, which I wasn't sleeping
high altitude.
Hi, yeah, and I gave it no respect. Like I really didn't.
Yep.
I gave it no respect at all. But like my oxygen saturation overnight, according to my Oura ring, was like 86.
Yeah, that's actually. It's funny you say that because I've always been really sensitive to altitude as well. And I lived out in Colorado for my master's degree. And so in Colorado Springs, it's almost 5,000 feet. I think it's like 4,000 something. But when I would go up to Breckenridge for like some races and stuff, it was so hard for me to do anything at any level of intensity. And I'm pretty sure I had a little pulse oximeter that I'd wear on my finger, and I just like test to see, and it was definitely below 90 for the most part, and it was near 90 almost my entire time when I was out in Colorado. So I didn't even bring up my oxygen saturation levels really as well as I would hope over the course of 2 years of adaptation during my master's.
So that's interesting. And so that was, I think, the reason that I reached out to you is because your Instagram was called Critical O2. Mm-hmm. And having that experience, so I was there for 5 days, I think. my oxygen never ever went above like 86%, I think
Yeah,
the whole
yeah.
time. And then I'm like, if that's what it is when I'm like laying here in bed, not moving, not exerting any energy at all, I'm like, now I'm going to get on my bike and try to ride up these mountain passes that went up
Mm-hmm.
to like 12,000 feet or something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've never like, it was really good for me, I think, to experience in a way to suffer that much
Mm-hmm.
in a way that was like, am I not fit? Like, what is happening here? But like, for sure, there's something oxygen related that like my body's not getting, and I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know what it was. I didn't understand it, and that's when I reached out to you. It was like, hey, help me understand what is the, because you were welcoming questions at the time. So I'm like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know this guy, but like it's called critical O2 and I'm definitely missing O2. I got
Yeah.
very oxygen. So like help me understand. So I think that was the beginning of our interaction, with
Mm-hmm.
that. And I never really figured it out. And then I just kind of let it go because I was like, well, you know what? I live at sea level, so we're just going to call it good. And I'm just not going to go back and try to ride mountains at 10,000 feet anymore.
Yeah, or even if you do go back, right? There's a few things you could try. Like, well, I think always, I always just recommend for people to test their iron, ferritin levels, hemoglobin levels, those sort of things, just to make sure they're kind of on a little bit more of like the higher side of things, or within the healthy range, but a little bit more on the high side of things. And then from there, if you do go to altitude again, something that might be beneficial is doing extended heat training. And the reason for that is because extended heat training seems to, in some people, increase hemoglobin mass. And hemoglobin is what is going to be, transporting that oxygen. So you might
Mm-hmm.
be able to protect it a little bit better, if you do 5, 6, 7, 10+ weeks of 1 hour of heat training, every day for about an hour leading up to that. That's a
And
lot,
yeah,
but
I mean, I live here in Hawaii and it was summertime. So like the idea that I wasn't getting heat training,
yeah.
in my mind, I'm like, okay, well then let's define that heat training. What would that look like? I'm already running and riding my bike in 86 to 90 degrees with
Hmm.
90% humidity pretty much every day.
Yeah. So maybe,
And my hemoglobin is definitely low. Like when I go get the red blood cell tests and all that, like it's always been like I'm on
yeah.
just the lowest edge of like where my doctor says, oh, that's normal and it's fine. But it's like, I mean, is it though? Like, if my
Yeah.
hematocrit's like 38 and you're calling it normal, like, is that,
You might just
you know,
have a lot of plasma as well, just because you're, existing in the heat so much. But
right.
that should ideally come up with adaptation over time. So I wonder, and I'm not a medical doctor, so don't take this as medical advice or anything like that. But do you take iron supplements or anything like that? Have you
I,
tested your ferritin?
ferritin was on the low side and I started taking iron supplements after that interaction with you, but
Hmm.
not like that regularly. I'm not awesome about like remembering to take it, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'll take it for like 2 weeks because I'll remember and then I'll just forget one day and then I won't take it again. So I probably
For
still have
another
the
three
same
weeks or
bottle.
so.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I probably still have the same bottle that I bought 2 years ago. It's probably expired.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, I know that, and that's always the toughest thing is like, even we as coaches, I tell a lot of people is like, do as I say, not as I do, because I have a lot of really good advice, but a lot of the times I don't listen to it. I over exercise and get injured all the time. I preach all this stuff that's like go easy or all that, and so I know what to do in an ideal situation. It's just when you're coaching yourself or working with just yourself, it's a little bit harder to do that because I think we all think we can do more than we actually can, and then that results in overdoing it a little bit.
Yeah. Although when you get older, I feel like there's a degree of um, I don't know, learned maturity that comes with that. Like I'm a very different athlete. I just turned 50 and I'm a very different athlete now than I was even 10 years ago.
Hmm.
And I think in a really good way. So like my body is not as I'm not I understand that my body is not invincible in a
Hmm.
way that I didn't used to. Like, when I was in my 30s and 40s, like I was invincible and screw all of you. I can, yes, I can. You're wrong. I'm stronger than you think, blah, blah. And now I'm like, okay, I have these limitations and it doesn't mean I won't perform really well when I want to. It's just
Right.
a matter of like, I'm aware that I need to be picky and choosy about when I'm going to perform. And if I
Mm-hmm.
am picky and choosy about deciding, like, no, I'm going to work hard on Saturday. So Thursday and Friday, I'm going to exercise and I'm going to keep it really easy and make sure then that I'm ready. And then like on the day that it's like, that's the key day,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm like way better to go. And so that's been good learning. And I think that that is 25 years in endurance sport
Yeah.
experience, right? Like learning that.
Yeah. Yeah. My career hasn't been quite that long, but I would say, probably 15 plus years of uh, almost continually like having good seasons and then following that up with a bad season, of, overdoing it or something along those lines. And right now I'm dealing with a torn labrum in my hip that I think leads to referred back pain and like other things like that. So right now what I'm trying to do is just go really, really easy and do a lot of rehab / prehab and strengthen, like glutes, core, hamstrings, quads, all that surrounding stuff of the hip so that I can kind of bulletproof my hips. So then when I do want to come back and then actually start competing again, I don't run into the issues of like, oh, well, I accidentally went too hard this week and now my back hurts and now I'm out for a month. Because that's literally what happened last month, which was super annoying because I was crushing it and I just went too hard.
Yep. Don't get greedy. That phrase, don't get greedy, has been one that has been one of the phrases that helps me maybe more than any other.
Mm-hmm.
And because that is when we get hurt, isn't it? Like when things are on a roll and you're feeling really good and you're in the middle of the run and it was supposed to be easy. And then you decide that like, oh, but I feel really good today. So like, I'll add another interval day and it's fine. And don't get greedy.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get greedy.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get greedy. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I always preach to people is consistency, specificity, and progression. And consistency is by far and away the most important thing. And when you get greedy, you can't be consistent, and when you can't be consistent, you can't progress, and you can't do specific enough training, and everything just kind of unravels. So no, I like that. Don't get greedy, folks. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I'll probably have to keep telling myself that because I'm like, oh, I'll get on a roll, I'll start feeling good, and then I need to put that. I'm revamping my my workout room right now, so I need to just put that on the wall. And just say, don't get greedy. And just look at it and be like, when you're feeling like you want to do an extra hour or an extra few intervals, don't get greedy. You don't need to do that.
Okay, but this is a question, again, coach to physiologist.
Mm-hmm.
I would caveat that as a coach with like, if you want to get greedy, go ahead and get greedy with low aerobic endurance volume. It's like, don't get greedy with the interval work. Like, would you agree? Like, am I on track with that? Like, so I used to, in my younger days, I was very much like a more is more philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the more you can do, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really differentiate the intensity and like, I didn't differentiate intensity with the more is more.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think got me and maybe some of the athletes I was working with, unfortunately, I'm sorry, at the time, like into trouble because we likely did too much intensity too often.
Right.
And so now I'm like, okay, where did I go right with that? Where was I wrong with that? And I feel like more is more when it comes to low endurance volume. Like if you want to go long and the whole thing is easy and your heart rate's 130 the whole time, go for it.
Or even easier than that, I would say.
Yeah. And then be careful with don't get greedy with the intensity or how much hard stuff you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But so am I right with that about like more is more as long as it's easy and then be metered with the amount of hard work you do?
I would say yes and no. There's always confines, right, to how much, say, volume you're trying to get in, how much intensity you're trying to get in. The challenge is that you have a lot less wiggle room when you get to that high intensity stuff, right? So by adding in an extra 2 intervals or by adding in an extra workout per week, you're exponentially increasing the amount of fatigue you're accumulating. And it's kind of like there was a have you seen Cool Runnings? The
No.
Disney, so it's a Disney movie about
Oh,
the Jamaican
that this.
bobsled team and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, it's a bobsled. Yeah.
And they're doing their final run. So spoiler alert, don't listen to this if you're actually going to go and watch this movie. It's a few years old. You know, you keep seeing like flashes to like the edges and stuff like that rattling, and there's like a screw that keeps rattling, you know, and keeps unscrewing and keeps unscrewing. I I liken the high intensity interval stuff to rattling even harder and making that screw unscrew even faster. Whereas if you're doing a little bit more of that, like oh, I'm just going to go on a casual ride with my buddies on Sunday. You know, keep heart rate super low. We're going to be chatting the entire time. I'm going to make sure I'm eating enough, hydrating enough, those sort of things. That's just a little rattle, right? So it's a lot harder to overdo the volume, especially in cycling, compared to the intensity in cycling or in running or just in triathlon in general. What I will say is that the volume portion of things, where it gets a little tricky, is in the running side, because
Yeah.
running is such a high impact sport that you really have to like, even if you're running a 10-minute mile versus a 7-minute mile, you're still getting all of that pounding, right? So I would be more cautious with that in terms of running than in cycling. But yeah, you can definitely get away with a lot more volume in terms of cycling. But where the wheels or the edges start to come off is when you start to do a lot of high intensity stuff. And I see people all the time. They're like, oh, I want to do the Norwegian method because, you know, that's what the Norwegian guys are doing and that's how they get good, right? I'm like, man, do you really think you can handle 2 a-days of interval training? Yes, it is a little bit lower like intensity, but those guys are running 100 to maybe 120 miles a week. They need that extra intensity, and they've built up to that intensity in order to be able to facilitate it. Like these guys aren't just you know, like your Joe Schmoes, whatever. Like Jakob is literally trying to set world records in the 3K and then like the 2 mile and stuff like that. So you know, you have to be careful when you're looking at what those elites are doing and trying to be like, oh, I could probably do that. It's like, yeah, you could probably do that, but are you going to be able to recover from it? Probably
Well,
not.
yeah, the difference is, I mean, the latest video that Magnus Ditlev and his team put out showed like 2 days of his like key workouts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the like, and they were really specific. Here's exactly what he did. You know, this 2 hour ride on the trainer, the 4 times 30 minutes at like, you know, different what, you know, so they're saying his wattage levels, but you know, the first one, he's just easy warming up zone 2, averaging 330 watts, right, for 30 minutes. Yeah, and then get that. So then they take his lactate, and it was 1.6, and he was like, "Oh, that's kind of high." And so then he goes and does his next 30-minute interval, and it has like, I don't know, pieces to it, and I'm going to butcher it because I didn't write it down, but it was something like, it was higher than that. It was like 340 watts or 350 with like 1 minute of, you know, 400 interspersed in this
Mm-hmm.
30 minutes, like some more race, you know. And then it comes down in they test his lactate at the end, and it's like 1.3. And then, you know, and then he's out running, and then he did 2 more just like that. And his lactate never went, it continued to go down the whole time that he's working at like 350 watts or
So
more, you
he's
know, and
under his threshold. Yep.
under threshold. And then he goes out and he's running, and he ran 3 5Ks, testing lactate after each one. And, you know, he's running 15 to 16-minute 5Ks, and his lactate's 1.1. And so I'm
Wow.
like, okay, right. So like he's a different physiological beast than the rest of us. You know, so
Yeah,
like if you
his
look at
mitochondria. Yeah, his mitochondria are so good. They're just uptaking all of the pyruvate, and it's never actually becoming lactate. Or he's
right.
just really good at clearing lactate as well. I wonder too. You know, it's like those are long workouts. So like if he's not fueling a ton with carbohydrate, that's also going to lead to a little bit of carbohydrate depletion.
No, he
So
was, they
he
showed him, it
was
was
okay.
120 grams per hour. He was, you know, feeding himself of more. It might have even been more. I think he was trying to push it. Oh, I think on the bike he said it was like 130, and then on the run it was closer to 70.
Okay,
You know, but
that
if
makes
you,
sense. Yeah.
and so you go, all right, well, that's what those guys are doing. And then if you look at, like, say, a mere mortal, like, we're going to try to do anything, even, I mean, even half of that. And it's
Hmm.
like, well, the way that my body is going to respond to that intensity, is so far different than
Mm-hmm.
the way that his body's responding to it. And it's like, that's why I think for the average amateur to like watch and listen to those videos and be like, see, coach, I need to train harder because did you see what Magnus did? This is what he did. And it's like, he's winning. I'm like, yeah, okay, go out and do your exercise with your lactate at 1.1 to 1.5.
If you can get it that low.
Right?
So,
You know, it's just like, it's so not relatable
mm-hmm.
to all of us.
Yeah, no, I know. And those guys are so, yeah, they're superhuman, and it's like the intensity required to actually hit 1.3 is very, very low for a lot of us. And that's what you would really have to be training to, is the physiological variables, rather than being like, I need to train harder. It's like, yeah, you could go out and you could try to hit 330. I mean, I like to think of myself as like a very okay amateur cyclist. And when I was doing like VO2 max, I was doing 35 seconds on, 25 seconds off, and I was able to hit like 405 for repeats of like 5 or like 10, something like that. And that was about the max that I could do. You start to ask me to do even repeats at 330 of like 4 minutes, 5 minutes, those sort of things. I guarantee you I would probably be hitting VO2 max.
Oh,
And
I can hold 300 watts for 1 minute.
yeah, exactly. Like, it's like those guys are so far removed, and it's so impressive. And it's just like, I like the idea of it, but I always recommend, I think we even have a podcast that's like, don't train like the pros, because they are superhuman, and they're just next level. But there are things you can do in order to try to get better. And this is a quick juxtaposition, but one of the things that you were saying is you listened to one of the podcast episodes on breathing, and you actually have some experience with changing your breathing patterns and other things like that. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, breathing training, or, just your story on how you changed your breathing and how it affected your performance.
Right. So mine started, maybe it had like a different beginnings, if that makes sense, or like the origin of like why I started looking into breathing was not really even to improve my athletic performance. It was more like after I started working on breathing, I was doing it more along the lines of trying to relieve some anxiety that I had. Right. So like, and now, and as a coach, this is really good for me to be able to help athletes. Like, I mean, we live in Hawaii. We have opportunity to ocean swim a lot. I have a lot of athletes that are like deathly afraid of the ocean. Right. And they'll go to the ocean and they're like, and they're breathing high and tight, like up in their chest. And then like, lo and behold, they get in the water and they have a panic attack. And to be honest, like for years, I didn't equate those two things. Like, why are you having a panic attack? And I'd be like, well, obviously, like you're afraid of the ocean. You don't have that much experience in it. So you just need to get in it more, and then you'll be able to relax more. But I wasn't connecting where the breath played into that, right? And that we can have a very real impact on like both mindset and physiology from the breathing and from the way that we breathe and that we have. And so it was like, the more that I learned about how much it matters, the way that we breathe. And I think it's so common that people don't think about it because we don't have to, right? Like it's a subconscious thing. Your bodies are just doing it. They're doing it without us having to think about it. The reality is we're capable of thinking about it. So if I want to change the way that I'm breathing, I can choose to do that. And when I choose to do that, I'm choosing to change my state. And so when I'm in a state of, like, I call it high and tight, like I'm high and tight, I'm nervous, I might be talking so there's all sorts of physiological symptoms that go along with that. I could be talking really fast, my palms could be sweating, my heart is beating faster. If the mental state in that place is I'm not able to learn I can't really hear what you're saying, because I'm in like a fight or flight, very nervous, and I'm in survival mode here. But now I'm
Right.
about to go in the ocean to start this race.
It's a great mindset to have before jumping in the ocean.
You know what I mean? Like, so like from there, the chances of success, like in that scenario, when you're breathing high and tight like that, and you're not even aware of it, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody tells you like slow down and breathe in that state, when you're already there, the chances of them like hearing you being able to do that are not high.
It's kind of like telling somebody to calm down when they're really ticked at you or something. Good
Exactly.
luck. That's
Yeah. And here's the thing: when they're really ticked at you, they're breathing high and tight. They're
yeah,
in
yeah.
survival mode. Like it is all related, and so it goes way beyond sport. Like, I feel like this information about breathing is for like all humans.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, as athletes, we can use it to our advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about like what is the state that we want to be in for high performance, right? Like, are we going to be able to access our high performance when we are being hijacked in survival mode?
Mm-hmm.
Like likely not. And so that's really what led me into this whole thing. And then it's like when you start practicing breathing in your living room, just like low and slow, slowing it down, and then paying attention to what is my state then when
Mm-hmm.
I'm breathing low and slow. And you're like, oh, I'm calmer. I can hear you better. I can take direction better.
Mm-hmm.
I can think more clearly. I'm more creative. I can problem solve. I can, it's like, boy, that's a brain state that would be, helpful during an Ironman, isn't it? Like if
Mm-hmm.
you could be like clearly thinking and problem solving, and it's like, okay, so it was all of those things. It's like all of this is coming together, and so I started practicing more and more and then in a big picture way, what we're finding is using your diaphragm when you're breathing matters so much more than people think. And I remember, this is probably like a decade ago, I remember, some yoga teacher or something being like, breathe into your belly. And I'm like, I literally couldn't do it.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like my belly does not move when I breathe. Like I would breathe in, it's like
Yeah.
all up in my chest and my shoulders. And so I'm running, I'm running like this. And people
Mm-hmm.
are telling me that I have crappy run form. And I'm like, what do you mean? No, I just have big shoulders because I'm a swimmer. I grew up swimming. So my shoulders, that's why they're like this. And you're like, no, they're like that because your diaphragm is like all stuck up, and it's not moving properly, and it shoves your shoulders up and you're like this.
Mm-hmm.
You're like,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So really like the cue for me that has been huge in this is to breathe into my rib cage. So
Mm-hmm.
like the belly breathing stuff never really worked for me because I can do it now. I can make my belly breathe, but it still feels really weird. But if I breathe and make like ribs expand laterally and
Mm-hmm.
then contract. So if you sit up and you're like, I'll put my hands, you can't really see here, but like if I put my hands on my rib cage and I breathe out and it's like, oh, I want my hands to be expanding out, and then I exhale and the hands come in
Mm-hmm.
and my shoulders don't move then.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, the downstream ramifications is the wrong word because that feels negative, but like the positive effects
Mm-hmm.
when you full-time change your breathing so that your rib cage is going out and in all the time, where it's like I've practiced that enough in my living room that now I can do it subconsciously without having to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's like it improves your posture. So if you've improved your posture, are you going to swim, bike, and run better? Are you going to lift weights better?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to, it's like, yeah, okay, my posture is better. I'm thinking more clearly. My heart rate is lower. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's just like there are so many things about it. And it's like, but then you try to get an athlete to like think about their breathing and they're like, stop it, Michelle, just, give me the interval workout that I'm supposed to do today.
Right. You're like, well, you're doing intervals, but you're going to be sitting on a chair, breathing correctly, and you're going to be practicing contracting your inspiratory and expiratory muscles. So that's what you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do. Yeah, no, I know. When you were telling me or talking about this, I think doing things like cold plunges are actually a perfect place to practice breathing. And because that's what I've been doing. I went and I did a bunch of testing in Kentucky with Aaron Geyser, who's a co-host on the show, but a coach for Under IQ. And he's got a cold plunge, and he keeps that thing freaking cold, 41 degrees or something like that. So I finally got into it. And, I haven't practiced any of this for a really, really long time. And it was immediately just like high and tight. Everything is freezing. I'm shivering like crazy, all of that. So I was like, okay, there's obviously something I can get better at here. So now what I do is I'll do an ice bath every night, and it's practicing. I start before getting into the tub of like doing like a and like just trying to expand everything, get as much air in. And I saw my shoulders go up a little bit. But it's just the practice of moving more air. And then when I get into the tub, it actually gives me a better ability of staying focused and not getting into that like, oh, it's so cold, this is terrible. And then, you start shaking. And then once you start shaking and shivering when you're cold, like there's no coming back from that unless you get out of it. So that's something that for those of you who are listening who have a cold plunge and do ice baths and stuff, this is a perfect place to tie in better breathing, because nobody really teaches us how to breathe. And if you look at 99% of the literature out there that's talking about limitations to VO2 max, most of them point towards a cardiac limitation. But there is absolutely, if you do not breathe correctly, then your pulmonary system is going to be limiting your performance in some way, shape, or form. Whether that's releasing too many stress hormones because you're just in fight or flight the whole time, whether it's not moving enough oxygen in and enough CO2 out. So then, you have disbalances in terms of your metabolites that are, happening at the level of the muscle. Or whether it's just, like panic moments. Like there was somebody I was testing who was wearing a mask for the VO2 max test that we were doing, and all of a sudden they just ripped the mask off and were just like, oh my gosh, I felt like I was suffocating. And I was like, okay, like that's horrible. But what I noticed like on the actual thing is their breathing got super shallow and, super fast. And they essentially were doing that panic breathing. So I told them, I was like, look, this is what we need to focus on. When things get hard, especially like, on the bike, when you're in, an aero position or something like that, then you need to start breathing deeper and more effectively. And we need to practice that. So that's what I told their coach. And I'm hoping that they work on that, because I think that would be, especially during higher intensity efforts, that's something that's going to really, really help them at least, stay calm, focus on getting more oxygen in, CO2 out, other things like that. But it's not something that's necessarily talked about too often. It is getting talked about more and more, because I do think people are starting to realize that there are some limitations in terms of, us missing that. It's like the same thing. If someone's never been taught to run and they just, picked up running and they just started running, you can tell somebody, like, there's a lot of people who don't run effectively, right? They're leaning backwards or they're doing other things like that. And it'd be the same thing. If you have poor coordination, your economy of movement in the run is going to be bad. If you have poor breathing coordination, your economy of contraction or your efficiency of muscle contraction for your respiratory muscles is going to be poor. And then that's going to start to fatigue those muscles. And then those muscles actually could, wind up stealing a little bit more blood away from, your muscles, your brain, your heart, other things like that, and then limit your performance as well.
Yeah, a couple things to say about that. And I agree with 100% of everything you said. I have a similar experience with the ice bath in that. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I don't really need a lot more stress hormones in my life. Like I'm getting stress hormones from enough places. And so to like actively put myself in an ice bath and create more doesn't make a ton of sense for me personally. But the benefit that I found in the ice bath was the understanding that through conscious control of my breath, I can control my state.
Mm-hmm.
And that realization in and of itself is so gold, because then when you find yourself in a state that where you're really uncomfortable, or like something isn't going right, you're not thinking right, and you have that experience of knowing, hang on, I can change this
Mm-hmm.
simply by choosing to change the way that I'm breathing. I'm going to slow that down. I'm going to breathe into my rib cage. I'm going to extend the exhale. And from there, I can find this calm state, even in this physiological state of stress,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, like in the ice bath, it's a physiological stressor for the body, and my brain can remain exceptionally calm if I use my breath to do that.
Yeah.
And that is like, wow, what a golden thing, to learn. And what's funny is a couple of years ago, like the last time that the men and women both did Kona together, so like whatever year that was,
Mm-hmm.
I've lost count already, but Lionel Sanders was, they did like the race week videos or whatever, and he was staying at Chris Leoto's house, and Chris Leoto has, a house on the Big Island or whatever, and they had an ice bath there, and they were filming it like as if it was funny, like Lionel trying to get in this ice bath,
Mm-hmm.
and he's just completely freaking out. Like every night he's like, and he can't do it. And he's missing this ability to calm himself. And then you see like the others in the ice bath and they're doing fine. And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
what's the difference? And I'm like, well, because I'd had that experience, I'm like, I sent a message actually to Chris Lieto, like a private message. I mean, he doesn't know me from anybody. But I was like, I can't help myself. And I sent him a message. I'm like, teach Lionel how to breathe so that he can sit in the ice bath. And he wrote back to me with like, like the laughing emoji or whatever, like, because it was true. It was like, if he would learn how to breathe, and it would probably help him in a lot of areas,
Mm-hmm.
like I'd love to see him succeed even more. And anyway, that's a side, but I will say this, and I'm curious, like, I feel like there's not a lot of people who, I don't want to say they don't believe me, but it's like, it's one of those things where like the coach experiences the thing, and then the scientist is like, well, where's the evidence to support that? And I'm like, I don't know where your evidence is. Like my evidence is my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And, but a couple of years ago, when I really first started playing around with this breathing thing, and what made a lot of sense to me is that we are built to breathe through our noses, right? And our mouth is for eating and talking.
Okay.
And when you just think about physiology, right, like that makes sense. So like, yes, you can open your mouth and you can get more air in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But like in a general sense, throughout the day, night when we're sleeping, that kind of thing, using your nose to breathe made a lot of sense to me from like an evolutionary standpoint. And so I went out and I started forcing myself to nose breathe a lot when I was training, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was biking, keep your mouth closed, breathe through your nose. When I was running, and all but like the hardest intervals, I would make myself breathe through my nose.
Mm-hmm.
And it required slowing down at first because like I didn't have the capacity to move air in and out of my nose. And then after 3 or 4 weeks, it got much better. And now I nose breathe pretty much, like, unless I'm working very hard. Like I have to be like sort of extended time in zone 4 or zone 5 intervals before I'll open my mouth to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience of that, so there was no science there. And that's where I'm curious, like if you have any sort of idea, even what I might have been experiencing, but my experience felt like it felt less expensive.
Mm.
So like I felt like I was able to go and run. So once I was able to train myself to nose breathe. So say I went out and I was running and my heart rate was 150, average for a run. If I was nose breathing for that 150 versus mouth breathing for that 150, it felt like I recovered faster. Like the whole thing just took less out of me. And I was like, I have no evidence to back that up other than like my experience with it. But I spent 20 years breathing through my mouth, and now I'm switching and I'm breathing through my nose, and it feels less expensive. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know why that is. And then I started having some of my athletes who I thought would be more open to the idea, like, hey, you try this too and let me know.
Mm-hmm.
What's your experience? How does it feel? And a couple of my athletes would then go, the ones that did it, they would train themselves to, run marathons or whatever. And like, they would do really well in the back half, or like
Mm-hmm.
with like not fading. And I'm like, okay, so this idea of it being less expensive, like in what way, I don't know, but it seemed to work.
Yeah.
So any ideas on that?
I know there's like a lot of books out there that are like, that are kind of driving this, nose breathing and other things like that. From a research perspective, I think this is, we're still kind of trying to figure out, like what is the effect of, proper breathing mechanics and other things like that on endurance performance. So, I need to try to get, somebody who is like, more of like a respiratory muscle, guru researcher onto the show just to talk about this. But the way that it might be changing is that with nose breathing, it seems like you're breathing through a little bit smaller of a hole, right? So from that perspective, you might have to breathe more deeply and more forcefully in order to get in enough air in and enough air out. That in and of itself could be a huge difference between breathing with your mouth, which is, I got a big mouth, I can take in a lot more air through my mouth, but I can probably get away with shallower, more frequent breathing if I'm breathing through my mouth rather than breathing through my nose. This is me just kind of speculating and trying to put, connect a little bit of the physiology with the sensations. I do know that deeper breathing has a tendency to stimulate the vagus nerve, which is very stimulatory of the parasympathetic pathway, like nervous system. So that's how like the biathletes, the skiers that then go and shoot, that's how they calm themselves, is they do like very, very deep, slow breathing when they get up to the line to shoot their targets. So I think maybe that is kind of what's happening, is like the nose breathing probably isn't like, it's not like, oh, nose breathing is the only way to breathe. It's nose breathing requires you to breathe differently than if you're breathing through your mouth. And it requires you probably to breathe a little bit deeper, which would then stimulate the vagus nerve a little bit more, calm your body down, probably, potentially then spare a little bit of, make you a little bit more economical, in a sense. But again, I don't think the research, well, I would love to hear if there's anybody out there who actually has done a deep dive into this research and stuff. So definitely shoot me a DM with some links to articles and stuff like that, because it is super interesting. But yeah, it's like one of those things where there's a lot of people who get a lot of benefit from changing their breathing patterns, but for the most part, from the research sort of side of things, we've really focused on cardiovascular limitations and other things like that up till now. And I think, at least from what I've seen, again, so I think that there needs to be more research done in this area. And there's actually a review that just came out that was looking at the adaptability of the pulmonary system to exercise and stuff like that. And it kind of said that, yes, the pulmonary system does adapt. However, we're still kind of in like the early stages. Like, I think they were saying like a lot of the research is still in like lung cells and other things like that, rather than, in vivo studies. So we're still on the early ends of things, especially from the scientific perspective. But again, like, just because the science hasn't confirmed that there is a true benefit, if your athletes are getting the benefit or feeling like they're getting a benefit, because placebo plays a huge effect into performance too, then I would say, it's like, it's not hurting them, right? You're not telling them to go, take like beta blockers or something illegal, other things like that to keep their heart rate low. So at the end of the day, right, it's not this nefarious sort of recommendation or anything like that. So I say, it's like, give it a shot. And from an end, from your experiences, right, that's like, there is probably some value to it because it helped you. So there's got to be other people like you. There's a few billion people in the world.
That's what I think. And it's been really interesting because I've heard some like very top level coaches, and I've seen it on Twitter or whatever. They're like, there's nothing to nasal breathing that is magic or better. Breathe through your nose, breathe through your mouth. It doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, and so I find it really interesting. And my first question for them is like, no, like, have you tried it? Like, have you really tried it? Have you given it like 6 weeks of like really trying it? Or did you try it like twice and be like, this is a pain in my ass and like I can't do it very well, so scrap it? Right?
Right.
Because like
It's like with anything, you're going to be bad. You're going to be bad at better breathing if you are trying to breathe more deeply. And that's something that I've kind of played around with a little bit more recently is like, I have a VO2 master, and one of the real cool benefits of it is that you can actually see your breathing frequency and your tidal volume right on the screen in real time. So I'll have my iPad while I'm on the treadmill, I'll be wearing the mask. And what I'll try to do is I'll just try to be taking in as deep of breaths as possible just to try to change that stimulus a little bit more and, try to, again, breathe a little bit more deeply. And again, at the end, it's tough to say because at the end of the day, what really matters is how much air you're moving, your minute ventilation, and whether you're increasing that by respiratory frequency or by depth of breathing. I don't know if it really, really matters, right? I don't know if we have found from a research perspective if it is truly one or the other matters more. But
yeah, can I like from my coach's perspective,
yeah,
right? So like not from researchers. I at the same time that I was really starting to focus on my breathing is when whatever year, so it must have been 2021 because that's when the Olympics were happening. And I was watching the Olympic trials on TV. And I will admit, I don't follow running closely enough to know like who all the runners are and that kind of thing. But in a way that makes watching the trials even more interesting because I don't have any bias about like, oh, I hope he wins or she wins or whatever. Like I don't know anybody well enough. And so I'm watching from a very objective standpoint. And because breathing was such a high thing on like my awareness list at the time, I was watching these 5,000 runners, or like they were running the 5K on the track. And I was watching specifically their breathing. And I was just so amazed at how fast they were running. And yet when they finish, I mean, like watch any amateur finish a 5K, right? And we're like, right?
Yeah.
And then like, here's a guy who like just won the Olympic trials and he's going to the Olympics. And I swear to God, he's breathing through his nose. I mean, like maybe his mouth is like slightly open, but he clearly was so in control of his breathing the whole time. And I don't know what pace he was running, but it was ridiculous.
It was
and
fast,
it was just
yeah.
like, it was just, he's breathing just deeply through his nose and he's not hyperventilating at all. And so I'm like, those guys who are they're the fastest runners in the world and their breathing is under control. So like, I have a really hard time believing that like your breathing being under control doesn't play a role somehow in your performance.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like just the fact that they can, like that they've trained themselves to run that fast while their breathing is still under control. Is that what gives them the ability to run the last 200 meters the way that they need to run the last 200 meters because it's been less expensive for them
Right.
for the first 4,000.
Right. Or
Right.
or
so,
is
in
their
my mind,
lower
I'm like,
breathing yeah, or to play devil's advocate, is their breathing a product of all the training that they've been doing so it's less, less metabolically expensive so they don't have to breathe as much. That it's
well, right, but either way, right? Like,
right.
Because if you didn't prioritize the way that you were breathing, even if you were only exercising 3 hours a week, I would be like, well, even then, prioritize your breathing. Like, how is it hurting you to do that? I don't know. I mean, it was just interesting for me to see that 5,000 and be like, wow, those guys are not even breathing hard. And like, if I tried to run 100 meters, what they were doing, the breathing would be insane.
I know. Yeah, it really is. It really is an interesting new avenue for people to focus on and potentially give their try to reprogram their breathing patterns and other things like that. Because if you think about, and this is actually a perfect juxtaposition into the mitochondrial talk we want to have. But if you think about the things that could be limiting performance, it could be, well, a number of different things, but your breathing plays into effect there. Your cardiovascular system and its ability to deliver oxygenated blood and remove metabolite-rich blood, and then your mitochondria's ability to extract that oxygen. So you can't really do too much other than making sure you have enough, or making sure you're doing adequate training in terms of a cardiovascular benefit. And you got to make sure that you have adequate levels of hemoglobin, ferritin, iron, that sort of stuff in order to be able to continue to get more oxygen transport. But largely, it's like that's just going to kind of play out with whatever training that you're doing. Mitochondria, kind of the same way in terms of they're going to respond to the diet, to your training interventions that you're doing. And you can't mentally really will your mitochondria to get better. You just have to train in order to get your mitochondria better. But the thing that you can...
I wonder if that's true. I believe you. And at the same time, I'm like, man, the power of our brain, Phil, like you
right.
like what your brain can do. Like how funny you have to go, like, I don't know, maybe I can like mentally visualize my mitochondria getting better and like see if it works.
Yeah, no. And then, right, the pulmonary system, though, is not just under subconscious control, it's under conscious control as well. So you can control that, and you can potentially affect the way that it's working. And this is where there was somebody was using some derivative of HRV. It was like DFA alpha 1 or something like that. And they were saying, yeah. And they were like, oh, well, at this level, this is where your first threshold is. At this level, this is where your second threshold is. But then I was listening to some YouTube videos, and they were like, people were talking about, oh, well, I can affect it with my breath. So unless somebody is breathing the same way each time, then you're not going to be able to get the same, outcomes. And I was like, well, everything seems to be affected by your breath then, right? Because if you're breathing more slowly, you're probably you're decreasing the inner thoracic pressure, which is allowing more blood to fill into your heart, which is probably going to allow for your heart to beat slower because you're increasing the amount of blood that's in the heart every time before you beat it. So if that's the case, then your heart's working a little bit less. You're moving the same amount of blood. And so it's like, so if you are breathing extremely shallowly and very quickly, then it's like you probably aren't getting adequate gas exchange. So I'll get off that, that tangent and that soapbox. I do think, for the best way to see if you actually have, some sort of weird pulmonary, breathing patterns or limitation within your pulmonary system is get hooked up with somebody who's good at doing VO2 max tests and measure your ventilatory variables. And then from there, do some spirometry testing as well. If you have any questions about that, please DM me and I can give you kind of like my criteria for what I look at in terms of, respiratory frequencies and what they should get up to, and then what your FEV1 over FVC should be. But yeah, like it's always something. It's like, well, if you're kind of doubting it, go test it, see if you have some limitations with it, and then worst case scenario, you practice it for 6 weeks, you stay consistent, you do whatever it is, and then you don't get better, and then you just go back to doing your old training. Like,
yeah. I would be curious, since you have that mask. I don't have that mask, but if I did have that mask, what I would want to do with it, and this is why I'm like, I'll throw it out at you, like, just test yourself and like let us know that if you're watching your ventilation rate and you are focused specifically on making your rib cage get bigger and smaller when you're breathing, right? So like the specific thing about, instead of just like, I'm trying to breathe deeper, try to like breathe laterally into your ribs and see if that in and of itself changes things, like while you're riding your bike, with that mask on, if it changes anything at all. I would be really curious. I would sort of be surprised if it didn't, but at the same time, I don't know enough about it to predict exactly what it would change. But it feels to me like I feel like something changes inside me when I breathe that way, I
Yeah.
don't know what it is.
I just the last thing I like using the cue. I think Andrew Huberman kind of talked about this of like you breathe in as deep as you can, and then at the very last second you do another, sort of like
Hmm.
breath in, and that gets you and that's what I had been practicing when I was running on the treadmill, and I was getting tidal volumes upwards. I was pushing about 4 liters per breath, which is a lot of liters per breath. At least from what I've seen in my testing and all of that. So yeah, I'll give it a shot and I'll let you know. I'll let you know how it goes. I don't have a treadmill here. I was doing the treadmill testing somewhere else, but I could definitely
Mm.
do it on the bike as well.
Yeah, it'd probably be easier to do on the bike, I would think, because like somehow being over, like on your bars,
Yeah,
somehow it's easy for me to think about like breathing into my rib cage. I never thought about that Huberman like extra inhale
yeah,
during exercise. I've only ever done that at rest.
yeah. That's
So
what
now
that's
I'm
what
like,
I
oh,
had
I'm
been
on.
using. Yeah, that was my cue because like the moving the ribs out seems a little harder for me. So like I was like just trying to get as much in as possible. And I think just by doing that, you have to be expanding your rib cage, to some extent to get
Well, I think
more.
what you will likely find is that the more you do that, the easier it will get to move you. Like it's
Right.
just like anything, right? Like so, right now it's like if your intercostal muscles are kind of like tight and sticky because you haven't been working them a lot. But I would even do that in like the step inhales, trying to make my rib cage get bigger and then bigger and then bigger and
Hmm.
then bigger and then smaller and then smaller until you learn how to control like you get control over those intercostal muscles
Yeah.
by playing with rib cage like that. And then over time you find that like, oh, it's just so malleable, it's so flexible, it's so easy to move a rib cage. And when you understand that your diaphragm is right under there and it's the diaphragm expanding that makes the rib cage go out, and you're like, well, that's a super way to make sure that your diaphragm is involved,
Hmm.
and the diaphragm affects everything else.
Right.
So yeah, I mean that I don't to me that just makes a ton of sense. And I feel like it should be taught more. And I'm like, why do I not hear that being taught more? And I'm like, am I like totally out in left field and I'm super wrong about it? Or am I like way ahead of the curve? I don't know, but like nobody's talking about it, but I
Yeah.
feel like they should be.
Yeah. No, I think we'll see kind of more and more. There are books out there, right? The Oxygen Advantage and other things like that
Hmm.
that talk
I've read
about
all
breathing
those.
patterns and all of
Yeah.
that. I don't think you need to go as far as taping your mouth shut and doing and doing other things like that. Like I guilty done that sort of stuff. Didn't find that it changed my sleep quality or anything like that or any of the other touted benefits, but maybe that's because I already breathe through my nose most of the time.
It probably is because I actually have done it too. And I had a couple of, again, like the athletes that I thought are open minded enough to try it. And
Hmm.
I'm like, hey, just try this and like let me know what you experience. And I had an athlete come back and be like, I just had three of the best night's sleep I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
It, like taping his mouth closed. And so you're like, okay, well, for him, then he probably was sleeping with his mouth open.
Yeah.
And for him, it really made a big difference. And so you would go, like, yeah, for some people, it maybe matters more than for others.
Oh, absolutely, and that's something there's individual variability for everybody, right? So some people it's probably great for, other people like I said, for me, it didn't really affect my sleep. There's a lot of other things, and I think that's too. It's like as a coach, you have to figure out like what is the best thing that's going to get the most bang for your buck for your athlete. So if you watch them and they're like, oh wow, their breathing is like these 5K runners during the Olympic trials, they probably don't need to practice their breathing, right?
Yeah.
But if you have somebody who's like running like this the whole time and they're the like that, then it's like, oh, we need to slow things down. We need to
Yeah.
practice the breathing and do that sort of stuff.
I'm guessing that we're just about almost done, but I have one more little point here. And it's something that I just, again, it's my observation that I want to
Hmm.
throw out to you to be like, is there any like reason for this or am I imagining things? But so I coach a master's swim team. And so I'm on deck twice a week, like watching people of all levels swim. We have
Hmm.
very, very fast swimmers in the pool, and we have people who are more developing still. And the cramping that goes on in like feet and calves at times, like toward the end of a workout, I find really fascinating. And I wondered if there's a connection. And again, this is a theory, I don't know, but a connection between breathing short and shallow and how like high and
Mm.
tight, short and shallow for say like a whole hour, which makes a lot of sense when you're swimming. We're breathing through our mouths. especially if we're swimming, kind of fast. We're likely breathing pretty fast, maybe so fast that like oxygen exchange at the extremities is not being prioritized anymore. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, I think just to tweak that a little bit, like, um, it would most likely be a little bit more of your ability to offload CO2 rather than oxygen. So your oxygen, as the oxygen delivery generally stays pretty good. I think though it would probably be a little bit more of the CO2 offloading. So then metabolites and everything are gonna be maybe building up a little bit more within the muscle because you're not able to get rid of it fast enough. And actually, your brain is a lot more sensitive to CO2 than it is changes in oxygen.
so help me understand this because, okay, so there's something called the Bohr effect,
Oh boy,
right?
yeah,
So is this beyond? So, and again, like I'm like Coach Brain reading this kind of stuff, and I'm like, help me understand. But like my understanding is that like so that CO2 needs to be present in
yep,
order for the oxygen exchange to happen at like in my mind I'm thinking even down at the extremities, right? So like we're cramping in their feet, calves, toes, that kind of
mm-hmm.
thing. And so in my mind I'm thinking when we breathe fast, short and shallow, we are offloading lots of CO2. I mean, that's what hyperventilation breathing is about, is we're offloading CO2. And so I wondered if the cramping was happening because the oxygen exchange at the extremities was like less efficient and effective because we really don't have enough
Mm.
CO2. And that if we slowed the breathing down, we would keep at least some CO2 enough to allow that exchange to happen at the extremities. And again, that is just like a complete theory on my own that I'm like
Yeah,
just trying to marry like what I've read and what I see on deck. Like, I don't know, is there a connection? But I will say that there was a guy who I asked that he was cramping. He was a good swimmer. I said, sit out this 50, breathe through your rib cage, slow
mm-hmm.
like that. And he jumped in and did another 100 and he knocked it out in like 58 seconds with no cramping after just breathing, because I was like, just test my theory, just test it. Cause
Yeah,
like, I don't know if this is right, but like, I just want to see. So I had him like breathe into his rib cage, like try to reestablish like oxygen CO2 balance. And I thought, if that's it, then in theory, he would be able to do another 100. If that's
mm-hmm.
not it, then of course he wouldn't be able to. Again, him being able to do it isn't proof that like, oh, that was
Right.
right. But it was like a step in that direction of like pointing in that way, saying like, hey, maybe there's something to this. Let's keep experimenting in that
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm. So it's tough to say without actually measuring, how CO2 levels are changing in an athlete based on how they're breathing, because when you're exercising, you're creating a lot of CO2. And that
Yeah.
CO2 is being sensed by your brain, and then your brain actually can trigger the subconscious breathing patterns to actually breathe off that CO2. And really, really minute changes in CO2 in your blood will change the amount of breathing that you're actually doing. Your brain will signal, we need to get rid of this stuff because it's, bad for the system. So that's what I've always been taught. I
Yeah,
don't
and can I just ask a question? Is that trainable to some degree? Like, I thought I'd heard somewhere, and again, the validity of this, I don't know,
like
but like that we can train our brains to tolerate a higher level of CO2, and like so then we're less sensitive to it, which
yeah.
means we can keep more on board without feeling the need to overbreathe. Is
I've
that a
I,
thing?
I've heard that same theory, and I don't know in terms of, I don't know the breathing literature, so I don't know if there's been studies where people are like, oh well, we practiced slow breathing for 6 weeks and got better at CO2 management, or able to
Yeah.
have higher levels of CO2. So I don't know that. Um, I mean, if you look at some of like the very elite level swimmers, they'll do a 50 and they won't even breathe once, right? Whereas
Right.
like other people are like, holy crap, I need to breathe every stroke during a 50. So there's probably some level of trainability and some level of
There
CO2
100% is
tolerance.
because I've
Yeah.
I've fully trained myself in that. Like I used to be absolute like before I did my own breath training stuff like in my living room in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
I hated breath sets in the pool. I'm like, I can't do them. I absolutely suck at them. And then after I did a lot of that respiratory, just slow breathing training, in my mind, I will tell you, I don't know if that's what I was actually doing, but what I was envisioning that I was doing was increasing my brain's tolerance for CO2.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would go into the pool, and I've been a swimmer my whole life. So, I mean, I know what different things feel like. I mean, I could get in and swim a 50. I couldn't swim a 50 hard with no breath, but I got to the point where I could swim a 50 easily with no breath,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like with very little effort. And it didn't even feel like I was really taxing myself.
Right.
And it forced me to like relax in a way that I think there's some benefit to that. So I don't know. I do feel like I trained it, if that makes sense. But maybe we're like,
I absolutely, I do think there's some level of trainability. We can't forget though, in terms of slowing down your breathing is going to allow you, like, so your lungs, right? You know, there's different levels of it. If you're breathing very deep, you're going to be getting air into the bottom of those lungs and then conceivably pushing the air out from the bottom of those lungs. And you're going to get better at forcefully ejecting it as well, right? So that's another key thing. I think when people are hyperventilating, that air is only going down to here, right? It's not going all the way down. So you're only able to really access that mixing chamber of, you know, like the first, I don't know, like 8 inches of like trachea pulmonary system. And from that perspective, maybe and again, I would need to actually measure this in terms of CO2 emission, you know, from the mouth, other things like that, how it's changing in terms of the muscle, because I would say that shallower breathing is probably resulting in less, even though it seems like we have a lot of gas exchange, it's resulting in less gas exchange, less oxygen, right, less CO2. So then you are then potentially building up CO2 within your blood, and then, you know, your muscles really aren't too happy, because those are all like the fatigue related or the cramping related responses and stuff seem to be related a little bit to either doing something that your muscles aren't used to, or not being able to adequately exchange. I think I just made a post about this, not being able to adequately exchange hydrogens and inorganic phosphates. And then you have a bunch of ramifications of not being able to reestablish electrolyte balance for, you know, muscle contraction and other things like that. So that's a little bit more of my theory and what I think. And then what I think is happening when people are breathing more deeply, they're exchanging gas better. And they're reaching back into, I know the Bohr effect is a thing, but they're getting back into that optimal level, because it's like with anything, there's an optimal level. And then when you start to get too much acidity, shit's just hitting the fan. It doesn't matter how much oxygen you're able to pull off of, you know, your red blood cell. If you have so much hydrogen and inorganic phosphate that it's inhibiting your muscle's ability to contract, then it doesn't really matter how much oxygen that you have in there, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I just think it is really fascinating to even, and it's like, I know most athletes are not thinking about this like at all. They probably don't need to.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I'm like, if there is something to that, and the cue can just be like, slow your breathing down, you know, a bit from where it is, or breathe into your rib cage, and that like has this cascade effect of improved performance for the athlete, then like, super.
Yeah, well, and that's what I think makes really good coaches is that they have things that they notice and they have theories that they want to test, and then they test it, see how their athlete, like essentially you're becoming a little bit of a scientist, right? You're doing these little N of 1 studies with all the knowledge that you've learned. Obviously they're not, you know, hyper controlled or anything like that, but that's kind of real world, right? This is the whole point of this series, translating science to coaching.
Not even kind of. It's very real world.
Yes, it is literally the epitome of real world. And
epitome.
And I would say, it's, the cool thing is that most of the time we can come to a physiological explanation. Sometimes though, we don't have a physiological explanation yet. And, that's where, that's why it's called a doctorate of philosophy, because you're kind of figuring out, with the synthesis of all the information that you've learned, what might be happening. So that's why I say could and might, and maybe this is going on. One thing I will say though is don't, like, it's good to have like that information, but don't get blinded by, because I'm really learning this information right now, that's the answer to everything. Right. Because it's like if somebody tells you not to think of a blue elephant, that's all you think of, right? Or if you notice like if you buy like a new car or something like that, and you have like a black truck, I always notice every single black truck that drives by. So, so there's little biases and patterns. Like, our brain always wants to find patterns. So I'm not saying that, your thought processes are inappropriate. It's just make sure that it's not just because we're just thinking about the breathing that now everything, the answer is breathing, right?
Right. Yeah, no, fully. And genuinely, it's why conversations like this with other people who think differently or, have a different perspective is really important, because it helps open your brain. Because there may be some people who have never considered breathing, and considering breathing is an avenue that will help them. And then there's others that are like, no, look, it goes beyond that. It's not just that. And we could do that with any variable, right? Like, it's not just about your lactate. It's not just about your heart rate. It's not just about your, anything. It's about all these things.
Yes.
which is why we could talk about this forever.
I know. We haven't even touched on half of the topics that you sent to me before this, and we're already running an hour and 10 minutes. And I'm like, well, Michelle, we're talking all afternoon because we got a lot of stuff we need to talk about. No, like absolutely. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So I'm going to stop it here. This was actually an amazing episode just about, your experiences with breathing and, what might be the underlying physiology of changing in breathing patterns and other things like that. So I hope everybody got a lot of really good information about that. If there are any researchers out there whose primary focus is respiratory muscle training, breath work, pulmonary system, anything like that, please reach out to me. I would love to have you on the show just so we can dive deeper into this topic and actually get kind of another perspective on, what the current body of literature says and all of that. And then I can, go back to Michelle and I can tell her, where we might need to change our thinking, at least based on the research and where it is right now. Or where maybe we can confirm some things and we're kind of on the right track, which I hope that's where we're headed, is always getting a little bit better every day. So, as always, you can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. That's the best place to contact me. Reach out to me with questions, comments, guests that you want to get on the show. I don't have too much pull in terms of who I can get on, but I will gladly DM somebody and say, hey, love to get you on the show to, share your different perspective. You can find Michelle. Where can people find you?
I'm at Mama Simmons with an _ on Instagram.
Cool.
It's the easiest place probably.
Yeah. You can find Michelle there. Reach out to her if you're looking for coaching or anything like that, or even if you have, follow-up questions for this podcast. And yeah, as always, like, we invite, questions, discussions, other things like that. So don't be strangers. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this podcast episode. We'll definitely be getting Michelle on in the future, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.